What's going on, guys? It's Jake. Welcome back to Music Domain. Today, we'll be trying something a bit different for this channel. We're going to be looking at Queen's smash hit single, Bohemian Rhapsody. But not in the way you might think. Everyone's familiar with this pop culture classic since its initial 1975 release on the album A Night at the Opera, and a subsequent re-release in 1991 following the death of the lead vocalist Freddie Mercury. Bohemian Rhapsody has steadily remained a chart-topping masterpiece, perfectly encapsulating the ever-changing musical style of the progressive rock era. This song's iconic status has also been no more prevalent than it currently is, as the recent release of its remake movie has elevated its already immense popularity to unprecedented heights. But while we're all familiar with the song's legendary lyrics and powerful, bombastic instrumentalism, many not be well versed in the more in-depth musical elements that really make the song what it is. Suffice to say, our analysis won't be so heavily focused on some of the other topics that have already been discussed in plenty of other places on the interwebs. Song production, lyrical symbolism, and what have you. Today, we are taking apart this song note by note, chord by chord, rhythm by rhythm, and diving into the real meat of what makes up a piece of music. Today, we're talking music theory. Now, just as a disclaimer, we're going to be doing some pretty hardcore musical analysis here, so if you're one of those, I don't have to understand it, I just like the song kinds of people, this video might not be your cup of tea. But if this stuff intrigues you, or if you have ever wondered what goes into making a song, we encourage you, stick around. And besides, even if you've never taken so much as a middle school level music class, we'll make sure you aren't totally left in the dust once we start getting into the real nitty-gritty of this. Well, with that out of the way, let's get started. So, a good place to begin might be, what the heck is music theory anyway? Well, in so few words, music theory is the analysis of the technical aspects of music. Think harmonies, melodies, chords, rhythms, song structure, and a whole host of other music-y sounding terms, and how they fit together to create a full composition. Things like sound engineering, mixing, and production stem from music theory, but are less so focused on the theoretical analysis. Now, if you're not all too familiar with the aforementioned terminology, don't worry, we'll start off slow and pick you up on the basics. Anyway, regarding this video's main topic of conversation, Bohemian Rhapsody, is truly a testament to the musical aptitude and talent of the band behind it. Masterfully blending a vast gamut of musical elements into a concise yet widely varied work. The 6-minute suite is comprised of 6 distinct sections with no chorus, combining a multitude of desperate styles into a single piece. This disjointed, yet simultaneously cohesive composition tactic weaves a powerful and complex narrative that is ever-changing, but is never disorganized. The first section is a 5-part a cappella, meaning vocal only, introduction, with the lyrics questioning if life is real or just fantasy, ultimately concluding that there is no escape from reality. Now, to understand this next part of our analysis, you're going to have to understand some of the basics of how we build a chord. If you're familiar enough already with the basics of harmonic concepts, or if you've ever taken a music theory class or two, or involved yourself in songwriting, or have watched our crash course in music theory video here on Music Domain, skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. The most common types of chords are triads. The word chord, by the way, can essentially refer to any collection of notes played together at the same time, or as part of an underlying harmony in a musical passage. A triad is just one type of chord. Triads involve picking a starting, or root note, and building upon that note, and moving up 3 notes at a time, an interval known as a third. When making a triad, we can either move from one note to another by a major third, which sounds happy, or a minor third, which sounds sad. Since a triad is made up of 2 thirds stacked on top of each other, we can combine these major and minor thirds to form 4 fundamental different kinds of triads. Major, which, like a major third, sounds happy. Minor, which similarly, like a minor third, sounds sadder. Diminished and augmented, which both sound weird, but we'll discuss them later when they come up. Anyway, if you continue up from there and you add another third of either kind, you'll get what is called a seventh chord. Due to the fact that the top note is, surprise, surprise, 7 notes up from the bottom. Now, again, you can mix and match different kinds of thirds to create different types of seventh chords, but the one you just heard has a special property. It is constructed by picking a root note, moving up a major third, moving up a minor third, and finally ending off with another minor third. These chords, called dominant seventh chords, set up a resolution to a major or minor triad built on the note 4 notes up from the root of the dominant seventh chord, meaning that they give a very strong and satisfying sense of finality when moving in that way. In what you just heard, a dominant seventh chord with a root note of F resolved to a major triad with the root note of B flat, as B flat is 4 notes up from F. Alright, got all that? Maybe not, but that's okay, because we're about to put all of this into practice so you can see what we're talking about. Moving back to Bohemian Rhapsody, we see that the first part of the intro is littered with these dominant seventh chords, each one followed by a subsequent resolution. The trouble is, these chords don't resolve to triads, they resolve to more seventh chords. Each resolution still sees a movement of 4 notes, but when we get into our next chord, it just makes us want to go somewhere else. Here, have a listen to the resolution that happens between the word fantasy and caught in the first 2 lines of the song. And, well, just fill in the lyrics yourself. Copyright infringement is a dangerous territory to get into. What you just heard was a C dominant seventh chord resolving to an F dominant seventh chord, where normally you just have an F major triad as your last chord. You can hear how the tension from the first chord doesn't really dissipate once you hit the second. It kind of just shifts around. It would be like getting in a car, driving somewhere, only to get into another car and drive somewhere else. It's only on the word escape that we finally see some real resolution, where our F dominant seventh resolves to a B flat major triad. This somewhat reflects the hopeless and somber tone of the lyrics, portraying the idea of the perpetual and inescapable hardships in life with a harmony that seems itself to be trapped within its own cycle of unfulfilled resolutions. The next major point of interest occurs on the line easy come, easy go, little high, little low. You'll notice that the harmonic movement sounds very tight. That's because this section only oscillates between 3 different triads: B major, B flat major, and A major. Each consecutive chord in this set is a half step away from each other chord, the smallest distance used in Western harmony. This type of movement is described as being chromatic. Chroma means color in Greek, as this motion is often used to give extra depth or color to a musical passage. The harmony moves back and forth between these 3 chords, providing a sense of motion, but without really going anywhere. The connection between the harmony and the lyrics on this line is subtle, and likely unintentional, but it almost seems as if the chords move to compensate for the lyrics. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, on the words little high, the chords move downward as if they were previously too high, and are now stepping down to remedy that. The inverse occurs on the words little low, as the harmony moves upward for a similar reason. Again, this was likely not intended by Queen, but is nonetheless an interesting musical point of intrigue to take note of. Now, so far the topics we've covered have not been particularly complicated. However, the next point of discussion is admittedly a bit harder to understand without some solid grasp of some complicated harmonic tactics. If we listen ahead to the line, "Any way the wind blows doesn't really matter to me," We hear another bit of chromaticism occurring in the bass part, or the lowest part of the musical phrase, or my part, baby. Now, the actual notes of this part are not the complicated part. Simply moving from an E flat, a half step down to a D, a half step down to a C sharp, and another half step down to a C. The trouble here lies in the chords set up by the first notes. The first half of this line makes perfect sense over the bass note E flat. We have an E flat major chord. Over the bass note D, we have a B flat major chord. Which still works, because D is one of the notes in that chord. When the root of a chord, the note that the chord is built off of, is not at the bottom of the chord, we say that that chord is inverted. However, over the C sharp bass note, we hear a C sharp diminished seventh chord. Okay, what's going on here? Well, if we look at the next chord, we see an F major chord with a C in the bass. Which again makes sense, as C is still part of an F major chord. With this in mind, we can actually view the motion of this C sharp diminished chord to this F major chord in a very similar light to our previously analyzed dominant seventh resolutions. The dominant seventh chord that resolves to F is C dominant seventh. Now, a C dominant seventh chord is comprised of the notes C, E, G, and B flat. Now, if we look at our C sharp diminished seventh, by the way, a diminished seventh chord is just another type of seventh chord, don't worry too much about the names of stuff, we see that it is comprised of the notes C sharp, E, G, and B flat. In essence, what this means is that because the C dominant seventh and C diminished seventh share 3 out of their 4 notes, they can often be interchanged and still serve nearly identical functions. The concept of substituting one chord for another very similar chord is called, aptly enough, chord substitution. Music theorists don't often come up with the most clever names for things, wow. Now, none of this is to say that any 2 similar chords can be swapped out so readily. If we wish to come up with our own chord substitutions, it is imperative to swap out our first chord with a second chord that shares guide tones with the first. Guide tones are notes in a chord that define the function and determine where it's going to go next. In a dominant seventh chord, the guide tones are the 3rd and the 7th, named because they are 3 notes and 7 notes up from the root of the chord. In C dominant seventh, the guide tones are E, 3 notes up from C, and B flat, 7 notes up from C. The reason these 2 notes are so important is because they move smoothly to the 2 most important notes of an F major chord, the root F and the 3rd A. The E moves a half step up to the F, while the B flat moves a half step down to the A. If we look back to the C sharp diminished seventh, we find both E and B flat in that chord as well. The C can be changed to a C sharp, as it is not nearly as important as the previously mentioned 2 notes. The G can also be found in both C dominant 7 and C sharp diminished 7, but this is really only because it is equally spaced between both E and B flat. Now we move on to the first true verse of the song, which is fairly harmonically straightforward. Well, except for the bit towards the middle. The underlying harmony of the words, "Now I've gone and thrown it all away," does another interesting chromatic-y thing with the bass to what we saw previously. The bass moves down chromatically down from C to B flat to A and finally to A flat. The harmony on top from C minor to B augmented to E flat major to F major and finally to F minor. Now, not only is the bass moving over very small distances, the chords are only changing a few notes at once. Looking at the first 3 chords, C minor contains the notes C, E flat, and G. B augmented has the notes B, D sharp, and G, and E flat major contains the notes E flat, B flat, and G. However, in this case, the B flat is in the bass, not the E flat. The chord again is inverted. Between these chords, only one note changes at a time, the note found in the bass. The C moves to a B, and the B moves to a B flat, going from C minor to B augmented to E flat major, respectively. That D sharp you see in the B augmented chord, it's actually the same as the E flat found in the other two chords. Many notes in the musical alphabet have two names. When a note is referred to by two different names, it is called an harmonic equivalence. Moving from the E flat major chord to the F major chord, this is where we see the first major change in this whole section. From the E flat major chord to the F major chord, the bass note B flat moves down to an A, the E flat to a C, and the G to an F. However, despite the upper notes of the chords changing quite a bit, we still see the bass only moving chromatically. From here, we go from F major to F minor, with nothing changing except for the bass, which moves from an A to an A flat. The overarching harmonic technique in play here, where a chromatic bass line moves under mostly stagnant upper notes, is often called a line cliché. An interesting parallel can be drawn between this and the lyrics of this section, which reference a struggle to carry on with life as if nothing really matters. The bass is carrying on with its normal movement as if nothing was wrong, while the upper notes of the harmony fight to prevent themselves from moving forwards. After this first verse, we hear a second one that is mostly similar to the previous, with the primary difference being that it ends with a powerful guitar solo that complements the rich and emotional lyrics. At this point, we've reached the most intense part of the song so far, and with the next verse being somewhat less complicated, it's probably a good time to take a step back and discuss one overarching aspect of what we've heard so far, the key of the song. A key is essentially the grounding aspect of music, laying out the framework of what notes work best in a given passage. Of course, sometimes we dip outside of this basic groundwork, which is often where chromatic notes come in, as half-step motion often takes us outside of a key, but a vast majority of what we hear in modern music is based around this idea of a key. A key is comprised of a home bass, called a tonic, a note and chord that feel the most central and important when we hear them, and a scale, which are notes that work the best to keep us grounded in our key. Don't get what I mean? Well, let's listen to a series of chords. Out of those, which chord or chords felt the most central or at rest? Like they were the most important? Probably the first and last chords. They were both B-flat major triads, B-flat being the tonic chord in the key of B-flat major. The B-flat major scale sounds like this. All of the chords you heard sound good in this key because they all use notes from the B-flat major scale. Of course, that's not to say that we can't dip outside of these notes when we're in this key. It just means that these notes will often work the best when B-flat is your tonic. Anyway, we've mostly stayed within the key of B-flat major, with brief sections where E-flat feels like the tonic because of some different chords we hear. However, in this next verse, we, out of the blue, shift to the key of A major. A sudden change that, along with the other stylistic changes we encounter here, starkly juxtapose the previous portion of the song. Verse 3 begins with nothing except for a single A chord repeated several times, strongly establishing it as the tonic and forcing our ears to adjust to this new sound quickly. Though we have certainly established ourselves in this key, we quickly find ourselves once again delving into the worlds of chromaticism, with the melody rapidly moving between the notes D, C sharp, and C. On the lyrics, "I see a little silhouette of a man," further chromaticism occurs. In the Galileo section, where we have the high and low voices alternate on the word Galileo, with the low jumping between an A and a B flat, and the high voice jumping between an E and an F. From there, we go on to the line, "I'm just a poor boy, nobody loves me," which follows a similar chromatic movement pattern that we've seen before with the silhouetto line, moving between three notes, each a half step away from each other, B, B flat, and A. We hear similar melodic ideas a few more times in this section, each time serving to make the section sound more carefree and playful. Chromatic notes are often used to invoke this idea in music. The chromatic notes found in the single-voiced portions of this section are in direct opposition to the powerful and rich chords in the choral portions of this same section where multiple voices are singing at once, as heard on the words, "He's just a poor boy from a poor family," "Bismillah, we will not let him go," and other lines. The fact that two different vocal styles are played back-to-back repeatedly serves to add a great deal of variety to this verse. The competition being between these two different styles builds over the course of the section, finally culminating in the intense choral line on the words, "For me." This line ends on a B-flat major chord and is held out for a significant duration, re-establishing us in the key of B-flat major for the next verse of the song, the rock portion. Or, actually, maybe B-flat major isn't the right key to place this verse in. Come to think of it, no. The chord choices used here are much more indicative of a different key. B-flat mixolydian. Mixolydian is nearly identical to major, except the seventh note of the scale, the note right below the tonic, is lowered by 1/2 step. Listen to both scales played slowly. The second to last note in both scales, called the leading tone, is the only difference between the two. In B-flat major, it's an A, and in B-flat mixolydian, it's an A-flat. While this change may seem insignificant, it provides a substantial alteration to a previously discussed harmonic phenomenon. Looking back at our old friend, the dominant seventh chord, if we attempt to construct one of these chords built on an F, the dominant seventh that would resolve to B-flat, we would run into a problem in mixolydian. Normally the third of F, dominant 7, A, provides a powerful sense of resolution to the tonic note B-flat in B-flat major. However, in mixolydian, we now have an A-flat instead, which is a whole step away from B-flat and provides nowhere the same strong sense of being resolved. The chord you just heard in place of the F dominant 7 was an F minor 7, as we now have an A flat replacing the A, which is a minor third up from F, not a major third. This potential issue can actually be seen as a benefit in some situations, as mixolydian has a decidedly, for lack of a better word, cooler sound, preventing a musical passage from ever having a true sense of finality and allowing a song to keep rocking on without ever coming to a close. Another interesting property of mixolydian that we see frequently in this section of Bohemian Rhapsody is the fact that mixolydian does actually have a dominant seventh chord on the tonic. That's right, in the key of B-flat mixolydian, if we construct a seventh chord up from B-flat, we find we've created a dominant 7. A chord that sounds as though it would like to resolve somewhere else. But since B-flat is already in our tonic, and as such the note with the most grounded sound in the key, there really isn't anywhere else to go. The conflict between knowing we've reached our home base and still feeling like there's someplace else we should be is a big part of what gives Mixolydian such a unique sound. It's never truly at rest. This is exemplified by the verse in Bohemian Rhapsody, as a majority of the melody sits on a B-flat major chord, or a B-flat dominant 7th chord. You'll notice the occasional E-flat chord in there, a chord that is really only used to briefly vary a harmony that mostly stays pretty much on one chord. Notice the complete lack of any F chords in any capacity. This section is really trying hard not to give the listener any sense of resolution. On the second repetition of the melody, we end on an A-flat major chord. A chord that can only exist because of that A from major that got dropped down to an A-flat. This further drives home the Mixolydian-ness of this verse, as this chord denies us pulling sense that we'd normally get from a regular A going up to a B-flat. In the next portion of the melody, the "Can't Do This To Me Baby," we finally see the first use of an F chord, though, as we predicted, it's not the dominant 7 that we are all used to, it's a minor 7 instead. Again, this denies us any sense of strong resolution, as when we hear the F minor 7 going to a B-flat major chord, we get a sense of what we'd normally be hearing, but without true finality we would get from a dominant 7th resolution. We're still hearing an F chord going to a B-flat chord, just not in the same way we're used to. Turning our attention elsewhere, this entire verse also makes use of an interesting rhythmic device known as a triplet. A triplet in music occurs when we play 3 notes in a span where we'd normally only hear 2. If we listen to any part of this section, we pretty strongly hear the pulse, or the underlying beat of the music as 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. However, the melody is doing something pretty interesting with its own rhythm. On lines like, "So you think you can stop me and spit in my eye," we hear its pulse as sounding something like this: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Here, if we lay 2 metronomes over each other, one playing the main pulse of this section, and the other following the rhythm of the melody, we get a pretty strong sense of conflict from these 2 different beats. That's because in the time that we'd normally feel 2 beats of the main pulse, the melody moves through 3. This leaves us feeling a bit of disparity between how we might tap our foot to the beat of this verse. And the rhythm of the melody is trying to make us feel this ties once again back to the overall conflicting nature of this section with the harmony. As we discussed before, denying us the normal sense of resolution we've grown so accustomed to, and the rhythm pulling us in 2 different directions with its overlapping beats. The whole rock and roll style of this verse is also pretty different from what we've heard previously with the song, as the other verses have a sort of operatic feel to them, while this section bombards us with intense guitar riffs and blasting percussion. The final verse of this song somewhat returns to what we had earlier in the song, settling down after the powerful rocking drive of the previous verse. To be honest, there's nothing too theoretically fascinating going on with this section. It's a simple, yet poignant way to end off such an impressive work of musical integrity. The one thing to mention here is that on the final chord of the song, we finally hear what we've been waiting for. Sort of. The song ends off with an F major chord, which has 3 out of the 4 notes of an F dominant 7. It's the major triad that the 7th chord is based off of, just without the E flat, the note that gives the chord its name, of course. If it did have that note, it would be a terrible place to end off, as the chord would feel as though it would want to resolve, but it never has the chance. But it's none of the less interesting to see the basic parts of the chord we've been denied for so long finally appear, only for it to be the very last thing we ever hear in the whole song. And on that note, pun totally intended, we come to a close. Bohemian Rhapsody is a song densely packed with musical intrigue, and we hoped you enjoyed our admittedly pretty long foray into the theoretical side of this masterpiece. If you've managed to make it this far, please be sure to subscribe to Music Domain, check out our other channels here on Domain TV, and stay posted for future content. If you don't want to do any of that, well, I guess it doesn't really matter after all. Nothing really matters. To me. Peace.